Okay, so I am very pleased to have Will Ryan here. He graduated as an economics major, and he worked as an economist in international research at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. His focus was the role of the dollar and international response to financial crisis. And currently he's a fellow at the Singularity Institute and is studying how to teach rationality and build rational communities. And I will let Will take it away from here.
So first I just want to thank you all for inviting me here. This is an incredible opportunity, and I really like to talk about things that I'm very passionate for, and rationality and self-improvement are two of the most important aspects of my life, and I'm very excited to have the opportunity to share this with you. And I hope that you will all leave here with something you can bring back into your lives and, yeah, help to achieve your goals better. So I want to start with a law of probability. There are two events, A and B. The probability of both A and B happening must be strictly less than either A or B happening individually. So it turns out that humans, using our sort of native intuitive processing, don't actually function by this particular law of probability. And this gives rise to something we call the conjunction fallacy, where we actually rate more rare events as being more highly probable than less rare events. So in particular, there was a study done by Tversky and Kahneman in 1983. They had folks evaluate the probability of these two statements. Version 1, a complete suspension of relations between the United States and the Soviet Union in 1983. Version 2, a Russian invasion of Poland and a complete suspension of relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. It turns out that almost everyone rated the second statement more likely, even though the entire probability mass of that second statement was contained within the first. So here's another example that might hit a little closer to home from a 1993 study of MBA students. They were asking these MBA students how much they would charge for terrorism insurance under 3 different scenarios. Scenario 1, taking a flight from Thailand to the United States. Scenario 2, taking a round-trip flight. Scenario 3, the round-trip flight and the entirety of the trip. So how much would these MBA students on average pay for this insurance? The one-way trip, they paid $17.19. The round trip, they paid $13.90. For the round trip flight and the rest of their stay in Thailand, they would pay $7.44. So as we got to a more and more specific and narrow threat, they were actually willing to pay more money to insure it, and less money to insure a larger, more probable event from happening. So the moral of this story is that when we add more detail to a story, it sounds increasingly plausible, even though by the very laws of probability, this should be less and less likely to happen as stated. So how does this relate to rationality? Within the community, we generally like to separate out rationality into 2 different things: instrumental rationality and epistemic rationality. Instrumental rationality is about achieving our goals. So in this case, what instrumental rationality is not paying more money to insure a one-way flight than a round trip, right? If you're in a situation where someone can use laws of probability and reason to systematically get money from you, this is not being very rational. So what does instrumental rationality consist of? Actually, achieving our goals is a fairly broad thing to talk about. When I think of instrumental rationality, what I think about is picking the right mental heuristics, the sort of habits of thought that will result in us systematically achieving our goals better. One thing that I find crucially important here is that using the right heuristics, there's always going to be a trade-off between efficiency and effectiveness. we can spend a lot of time trying to figure out what the precisely optimal action is in any given situation and really get it perfect. Or we can get things 90% of the way right, but have it be a snap judgment. It can happen quickly, it can be mostly correct, and we can, in the end, yeah, it's acting swiftly and decisively to kind of further our goals. And I think that this is something that I've certainly struggled with, and I think a lot of highly intelligent young people do, is that we want the perfect answer. We want to figure out the right answer, instead of getting an answer that is good enough to achieve our ends in a pretty reasonable time. So the other part of rationality is epistemic rationality. And what this boils down to is holding true beliefs about the world. There's a metaphor that I really like called the map and the territory. You can think of the territory as being the physical, objective world around us. And the map is our sort of mental model of this world. And what epistemic rationality is basically getting the map to very precisely match the territory. I basically consider epistemic rationality to be one component of instrumental rationality. Holding true beliefs allows us to interact more effectively with the objective world. If our map is not accurate, when we're trying to achieve our goals, we can end up exerting a lot of effort in ways that are not actually going to be particularly useful or helpful in achieving these ends. So, just some examples of what having an accurate map can allow us to do. Think of the laws of physics. We used to have, pretty poor theories of what the laws of physics were, and for a long time, we were not able to achieve certain feats of engineering. But once we had Newtonian physics and then, Einstein and so on, now we can launch rockets into space, for instance. We can launch rockets that will hit a tiny, very fast-moving comet, like on the other side of the solar system. Like, this is actually a remarkably impressive feat, and this is entirely a result of a bunch of scientists discovering what the actual laws of reality were, how the physical world actually worked. And it allows us to manipulate the environment around us much more effectively when we're holding these true beliefs. We have skyscrapers, we have cities, we have sewage systems, right? All of these things are made possible because we understand how to interact with the objective world around us. So there are many different reasons that people will want to hold beliefs that are not truth tracking. I think one example that should be particularly salient here is going to college. Have you guys ever seen a study that, did a randomized controlled trial that said going to college is extremely effective at, improving your life, making you happier, making more money, having more friends? Or is it just conventional wisdom? People say, oh yeah, of course you should go to college. Right? So, when it turns out you actually look at folks that got accepted to very, very good schools, but chose instead to go to less highly ranked schools, these people on average made just as much money as the people that went to the highest ranked schools. And it seems clear that what college is doing is acting as a signaling mechanism. But yet we hold, or most of us hold, not those of us in this room, hold this cultural belief that more education is good, that we should go to college, that this is part of being a good citizen. So this is an example of when we hold beliefs for social reasons, because we want to signal to other people that there are certain things that we value. Another way in which our beliefs will depart from truth is when we take something to be a sort of core part of our identity, right? Like someone who says, I drink alcohol because I'm an alcoholic. What they're saying here is that there is this thing that is inherent to them that is ultimately causing their behavior, and there isn't anything they can do to interact with this to change the way that they are or their actions. Another reason that our beliefs might not be truth tracking is because we tend to value consistency over time. And if we said something yesterday, we feel a strong pressure to then say the same thing again today. Even though changing our minds is a perfectly acceptable thing to do in the face of actually getting new evidence from the outside world. There's a quote that I really like that was attributed to John Maynard Keynes, which is, "When the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do, sir?" Which I think sums this point up very well, in that if we are going to continually update on new evidence, that does mean that our beliefs are going to be changing over time. And it can be difficult when there's a social norm to express the same beliefs over long periods. So we basically have a lot more information now about how the brain works and how thinking works, and we can use this information to look at the way our own minds function and, as I said, pick new heuristics. We can reshape the very habits of thought we have such that we can systematically achieve our goals. So, rationality and self-improvement, how do these things kind of tie together? You should think of self-improvement as basically personal empiricism. You can use rationality to understand yourself and the world and the people around you increasingly well. And you can basically use the scientific method to make predictions about yourself and about the outside world, and you can test these models and you can update on the evidence. So I think it'll be useful here to talk a little bit about how I first did this incorrectly and then figured out how to do it a lot better. When I was, unfortunately, in college, I had basically been having sleep problems for a large part of my life. I was seemingly unable to fall asleep before about 3 or 4 in the morning, like very consistently from a young age. And finally, I was in college, I decided, all right, I'm going to go see a psychiatrist, I'm going to find out what this is all about. So I go see a doctor, and he basically says, "Oh, you just have insomnia, take this pill, you'll be fine." Okay? So I did this, and lots of negative side effects, still was not able to sleep. This doctor kept putting me on different meds because, my insomnia was not being cured. I kept trying all these different things, horrible side effects, didn't actually help my sleep, and I was just starting to feel like this was a part of my identity. I am the kind of person who cannot go to sleep before 4 in the morning. This was becoming this entrenched belief. So then one day, the doctor said, there's this new drug out. It's called Rosarum. Well, I tried it, because I'd been trying everything until this point, I might as well do something. And sure enough, I could fall asleep within 30 minutes. So it's like, okay, wait a second, what's going on here? I was surprised. I was updating my model of who I was, right? Because I had this strong belief. I was the kind of person who could not fall asleep before 4 in the morning. And I took this pill and it surprised me when it worked. And that surprise caused me to ask myself, well, what is my model of what's going on here? So I looked up what this drug does. It works on melatonin, which is a natural hormone that our body produces to regulate our circadian rhythm, which is basically our internal clock that keeps us regulated to, sleeping and waking hours. So I did more research, and it turns out that there are circadian rhythm disorders that actually a large number of folks have. And I realized I could have solved this problem by taking an over-the-counter supplement, melatonin, about an hour before bed, and I would have had no problem sleeping ever. But because I had failed to wonder, I failed to be curious about what was actually going on with me, and I accepted this limiting belief that it wasn't until through a complete accident that I was able to sort of shake up this mental model of myself and actually become curious about what was going on here. So I think a better example of when I was actually using rationality, I basically made a conscious decision that I wanted to optimize my health and longevity. And so I realized one of the things I should probably look into was my diet. Up until that point, I was living on a diet of pasta, pizzas, and burgers. Like, almost exclusively. And as you might expect, I was fairly unhappy with myself. I didn't feel well. I was sluggish and lethargic. I was fairly overweight. I didn't have a very good self-image. And I had been struggling with this for a long time. And once again, this was becoming part of my identity. You know, I am someone that eats these foods. I was a very picky eater. But when I decided to sit down and say, all right, I want to live as long as I can. I want to feel good. I want to look good. Once I did that, I then asked myself, all right, what is the underlying model of what's going on here? And I basically started to study nutrition, and I found this to be a fascinating case study in the application of rationality to a very important part of my life. So, the first thing to do when investigating any kind of new phenomenon is forget everything that you know. We get lots of received wisdom about what's good, what's bad, you know, all of this kind of information, and a lot of it, some of it is reliable, but some of it's not. And when you're trying to build a new model of something, it's very unhelpful to have this like static picture kind of stuck in your mind of what's going on. So I basically, with a completely blind eye, just started looking into a bunch of different fields of research to find out what exactly it was that was, you know, making me fat and unhappy. So the current conventional wisdom in our culture, as it currently is right now, is that fat is bad, and saturated fat is especially bad. This conventional wisdom, it turns out, has actually only been around since about the 1970s. There used to be older beliefs that actually didn't think fat was particularly harmful. And so the question is, well, how did we get here from there? What is sort of currently underlying these beliefs in our culture? So there are sort of a number of pivotal things that I would point to. The first one is using animal models in nutrition science. Basically what happened is they took a rabbit and they fed it cholesterol. Well, what do we know about rabbits? Rabbits are herbivores. In nature, throughout their evolutionary history, they've only eaten plant materials. Well, cholesterol is only found in animals. You just took an herbivore and started feeding it animal products, and what happens? The rabbit has an extremely hard time clearing cholesterol from its bloodstream. But we took this animal model that is actually really not very reflective of the underlying metabolic processes happening in humans, and we drew this massive conclusion from, oh my god, cholesterol is bad, right? This thing is like sticking to our arteries. So this was sort of the first stage of what became known as the lipid hypothesis of coronary heart disease. What's particularly interesting about this hypothesis is that it has continued to change over time as more and more information has come in, but it hasn't been falsified, it's just been modified. So there were a bunch of sort of large-scale prospective observational studies. So we are talking like a very large population over a long period of time that actually found no correlation between cholesterol intake and the levels of cholesterol in our bloodstream. And so once this happened, instead of rejecting the hypothesis, becoming curious, like, why did we get this result, right? Like, what is going on here with our model that is wrong? The model was instead changed. Oh, wait a second, it's not cholesterol, it's actually saturated fat. It's bad. Okay, well, wait a second, like, where does this, come from? So there was a particular researcher named Ansel Keys, and in 1966 he did a study that was known as the 7 Countries Study. Him and a bunch of researchers in 6 other countries decided to take a lot of data about basically health outcomes and food intake in these 7 countries. So the first thing to note here is that this is entirely a correlational study. All they were able to do is show that in these particular set of countries, the ones that had more saturated fat in the diet also seemed to have more incidence of heart disease. An interesting correlation worth exploring. This didn't actually provide any sort of underlying causal mechanism of what might be happening here. And the other really important thing to note is that this is a 7 countries study. the way that these 7 countries were picked was because Ansel Keys was friends with particular researchers in particular countries, and those were the countries where they collected data. This is an extremely, extremely biased sample. Extremely biased. And yet this study became, very, very widely published and very widely publicized and eventually believed. What ended up happening, Ansel Keys started working with, I believe it was President Eisenhower, who was suffering from some heart problems, and he was, desperately looking for some kind of answer. And, Ansel Keys came forth and said, well, we found this link between saturated fat and heart disease, and, sure enough, this view that Ansel Keys had became increasingly popular and repeated throughout popular culture. Another very, very big thing happened in 1977 when Congress created a commission to investigate basically what was causing heart disease and sort of what recommendations they could make. And it turns out that this commission was actually the very first time that the federal government had given any official recommendations about the way people should be eating. And as a result from this, the government now had a stake in the outcome here. A lot of the funding for the very basic fundamental research was coming from government agencies. And now these government agencies had something to prove. The government had an official position. And the government was also the one providing all the funding for all the research. And basically, unless researchers were going to be testing a hypothesis that the National Institute of Health, for instance, thought was acceptable, then they really weren't going to get much funding. And this resulted in a lot of crowding out, and there basically was from that point forward a lack of just basic fundamental research into questions that academia had decided were settled. Even though what was happening here was basically this reverberation, right? There was one particular study, there was one particular researcher who was incredibly vehement. Ansel Keys got on the cover of Time magazine. This was a public figure that was very vehemently and adamantly throwing out this low-fat message and making friends in very high places. And this message, even though it was originally based upon some very poorly conducted studies, just became repeated in popular culture, in the media, by official recommendations from the federal government. And what basically ended up happening is because everyone was hearing this one message, they believed that it was true. Because they believed that it was true, they started repeating it to other people they knew, and it basically created this information cascade where it's just this fascinating case study in what is possible when people are not being epistemically rational. You have this situation where these few studies basically completely took over the public dialogue and completely reshaped how science was funded and the very fundamental questions that they were trying to ask. So when I started looking through all of this data, one thing that helped is having a background in economics. I knew what a good study was and what a not so good study was, and it was very clear to me that the level of scientific rigor in nutrition science more generally was quite poor. There are in fact a handful of good studies, and there are in fact some very interesting findings, but these were definitely the minority. This was not the norm. So instead, what are sources of accurate information that I could get about this? So one of them is look at which cultures throughout history are empirically healthy. There are many, many cultures, mostly hunter-gatherers, that don't seem to suffer from anything like cancer, heart disease, any of these things that have really come to plague first world countries and are the leading causes of death in first world countries. these things were completely absent in certain cultures. Even when people in these cultures survived to a very late age, they still didn't seem to suffer from these things. So that was my first question, right? Like, if this is just some kind of natural process that happens, why are there cultures that seem to be completely devoid of this whatsoever? And what are those particular cultures doing? Another source of this is anthropology. We actually have a fair bit of data about early humans. We have their bones. There are a lot of things that we can do to figure out both like what humans were eating from the composition of their bones, as well as looking at the actual physical structure of their bones and seeing whether these were healthy, robust, large humans, or if they were small and fragile. Another thing that we have is evolutionary theory. Animals, for instance, can run away when they're trying to be eaten, but plants are quite literally rooted in place. They can't evade any kind of predator. So what is a plant going to do to prevent itself from being eaten? Well, there are various ways it can make itself unavailable, for instance, by storing energy underground in the form of, say, root vegetables. They can form armor, right? Like, for instance, nuts have a hard outer shell that protects a nutrient-rich core, the seed of this plant that is going to grow into future plants. And they can also basically become poisonous, so that other animals will regret then eating them. Another area that we can look to for actual data is biochemistry. It's quite shocking how big of a disconnect there is between these underlying biological mechanisms that are being studied in chemistry, in biology, and the sort of macro scale nutrition studies that are being done. This is a massive disconnect, and when you look at the biochemistry, you can actually see there are causal mechanisms underlying these things. But yet all of the theories proposed in nutrition science are divorced from these low-level underlying causal mechanisms. So I feel like this is a fairly good example of a way in which I was able to use epistemic rationality to understand what good evidence is, to know what a good study is, to do research, to be surprised, be genuinely surprised by what I found, and then start coming up with alternative theories. So how does this relate to self-improvement? Well, obviously, once I thought that I had a correct theory of nutrition and exercise, I immediately changed my life. I started eating completely different foods. I changed the way that I exercise, and sure enough, I started feeling and looking a lot better than I used to. A lot better. And this is, one of the most powerful ways that I think I was able to use rationality to improve myself and my life and become a more effective person. So, what are sort of the big aspects of self-improvement that I want you guys to walk away with here? The first one is that having a willingness to change is, I think, a prerequisite for doing anything else in self-improvement. And I think that the key thing stopping us from being able to change is that we do hold beliefs about who we are. We have this strong identity, and we don't want to take actions that would threaten this sense of self that we have, to actually realize that we can in fact be a very different person than we currently are today. And so I think just being genuinely curious about yourself and who you are and what is possible, I think is a prerequisite step for making any kind of changes in your life. The second big thing that I want to take away, that I want you guys to take away, is basically how do we actually change behaviors once we've identified something that we want to. And I basically think of this as a three-step process. Step number one is basically be aware of the behavior that you want to change, such that when you take it in that moment, something clicks with you and says, aha, look, I'm doing this behavior that I want to be changing. This is definitely a prerequisite step, because unless you're catching yourself in the moment, the longer the time delay is between the behavior that you're taking and realizing that you want to do something different, the harder it is to encode this new behavior. So what I recommend here is to basically be focusing only on a few particular behaviors that you want to change at once. you don't have enough attention, willpower, what have you, mental resources to be aware of everything constantly. Maybe someday we'll get there, but we're not there yet. And so it's very useful to focus on the few biggest things that would change your life if you change those behaviors right now. And then basically use most of your awareness to find those things in the moment so that you can begin changing them. The second step is basically, once you realize that you have taken this behavior that you don't wish to anymore, is basically to provide immediate negative reinforcement. And what I recommend is just feeling sad. Feeling sad that you are not acting in line with your optimal goals, that you are not currently the person that you wish to become. And then the third thing is basically to then actually consciously act to take the new behavior that you want to encode in that moment, and feel good about doing so. This is, in essence, what reinforcement learning is. And what I want you guys to take away from this is that it is possible to use reinforcement learning on yourself. And this itself is the very nature of how to change behaviors. And what's really useful here is that as you do begin to change these behaviors, as you do continuously take the action that you want to in the moment, what will happen is that you will begin to encode these new behaviors as habits. And you will become able to automatically take the action that best furthers your goals in the moment at all times. So piece by piece, it's laying down these new habits of thought, these new behavioral patterns that will help you to achieve your goals. So let's see, we have about 10 more minutes. Does anyone have any questions, comments? Yeah.
So do you eat paleo then? Is that the conclusion?
I do eat paleo. So I have a handout here of what I figured out about sleep and exercise and food. It's just one page that summarizes a lot of the information that I've tried to figure out over these years. Like everything, this is something that I do continuously update. And so, you know, I might figure out something even better in the future. But right now, I think roughly paleo with some particular modifications is probably optimal from as far as I can tell, and seems to be working well for me. And I have enough copies here for everyone to get a handout at the end of this.
So you were talking about rationality and the whole discussion in college, which is obviously relevant to everyone here. And the one statistic I always see trotted out again and again is the wage premium differential. So it's there. So people with college degrees, the median earning is like $56,000, and the median earning without college degrees is with just a high school diploma is like $33,000. So they always say, oh, well, this shows it's a disaster to not get a college degree. You're going to have like 50% less earnings. I mean, that just, it seems so silly when applied to the bright young people in this room that, you know, the idea that they're going to earn $33,000 as like fry cooks or something. But that statistic keeps getting brought out again and again. Like, how do you have an answer to that? Like,
In terms of what causes this?
no, just in terms of how to respond
to that.
Because they're making a pseudo-rational argument that it's a disaster, economic disaster to not get a college degree.
Right, so this is once again a correlation, right? It is an underlying causation. So how would I respond to someone saying this? I would basically say the kind of people that tend to go to college also make more money. But if the kind of person that would have otherwise gone to college did something else, I think they're likely to make just as much money.
Yeah.
I think that's my most concise answer that I think people might listen to.
Yeah.
So, often when we're talking about our business proposal, people keep saying, like, when you're passionate about that, you can become enthusiastic about it. How do you become excited and involved in something without it becoming such an attached part of your identity that you can't think rationally about?
That's a good question. I mean, I do think that it is possible to be very excited and motivated by something and still be able to think rationally about it. I think the critical component here is notice your surprise when something doesn't fit your model of the situation. Does that somewhat make sense? Like, I am very excited, for instance, about my findings about how to eat better. But then when I talk to someone who eats a very different way from me, and they ended up actually being much more healthy, that causes me noticeable surprise, right? Because I'm seeing that something in the world is diverging from my model. And if anything, because I'm so much more excited about this particular aspect, it is, like, because I hold these beliefs so strongly, any evidence against it is actually much more surprising, right? Does that somewhat help?
Yeah.
Are there any more questions? Let's see.
I have a question.
Oh yes, go for it.
Have you heard of like the Ray Kurzweil diet?
Not under that name per se.
Or I guess like this.
He wrote a book, Transcendent Man, right?
Right.
That has
He
a
has
diet.
this sort of like health regimen where he takes like a lot of pills all the time. Do you like do any of these types of things?
Yeah, so I supplement a couple of things. One of them is vitamin D. If I don't go out in the sun for at least half an hour, like full body half an hour sun exposure, if I don't get that per day, I will generally take some vitamin D. I supplement with fish oil as well. Most of our foods are pretty deficient in omega-3s, and a lot of the foods we eat have a lot of omega-6s, and the two act somewhat contrary to each other. So I do try to be mindful of that, and I will occasionally supplement with fish oil when I think I have been fairly low on omega-3 intake. Other than that, I mean, I've tried various supplements. I have yet to see a large discernible difference. I have gotten testing done, and I didn't seem to really be deficient in very much. So it's definitely something to keep an eye on, and I think there's a much stronger case for certain things than others. One thing that I've supplemented on and off, and will probably continue to do so, is magnesium, because this is something that we used to get through our water. But now that we have filtered water, most of the magnesium is actually filtered out, and so our largest, intake of magnesium is no longer present. It seems pretty likely to me that most people are deficient, and this seems to be what studies show. More questions? Very cool. Well, thank you very much, everyone. Is there something that you want to ask?
Well, so everyone should take the handout, but just you explain in 60 seconds generally what paleo means, or what the paleo diet is.
Right. So, in terms of the foods that I recommend you guys should be eating, mostly animal products for calories, meat, but particularly, if you can, the fattier parts and organ meats. I highly recommend eating vegetables, pretty much as you want for flavor. They're also a source of nutrients, but they're not the best. Root vegetables, so things like potatoes, sweet potatoes, yams, carrots, that sort of thing, is a very good source of concentrated carbohydrates. Personally, I tolerate dairy fairly well. Some people have problems with dairy, some people don't. If you can, I recommend eating dairy, and particularly higher fat forms like cream and butter, and fermented things like yogurt and cheese and so on. Those things form the bulk of my diet. I will very rarely eat fruit or nuts, but I don't think they're particularly optimal. I don't eat any grains or legumes, and I don't really have refined sugar in anything, and my sweet tooth has largely disappeared after that. And I don't use vegetable oils when cooking at all. Basically, olive oil is sort of on the margin for me, and I have lots of coconut oil. But other than that, mostly stick to animal fats in cooking.
Are there carbs in that diet at all?
The root vegetables are my source of carbs, yeah. I mean, in terms of what my macronutrient intake ends up looking like, I don't think this is any kind of magic formula, but it's about probably 10% protein, 20 to 30% carbs, and then 60 to 70% fat. I have done I mean, I've basically gone from 0 carb to mostly carb, and I notice fairly little difference as long as the source of the carbohydrates is coming from things like root vegetables and not coming from things like wheat.
What's your exercise regimen?
Yeah, so in terms of by far the lowest hanging fruit is sprinting. I would do it once or twice per week, and I would do like max efforts. There's something called the Tabata interval, which is 20 seconds of exercise, 10 seconds of rest. And I would repeat this 8 times. So this is a 4-minute workout once or twice per week, and you will get enormous benefits from just this tiny investment. If you specifically want to build muscle or strength, that gets a lot more complicated.
So Danielle left to set up the next speaker, and she would like us all back at the Sunset Room at 1:30, which gives you about 5 minutes to dump your dishes and put them through the dishwashing pipe, and then head on over there.